I'm very honored to be asked to do this. I've been privileged to be associated with the iSchool for over 15 years, from around the time Anno took over as dean. As you no doubt know already, you're going to get called on a lot to explain to people what a school of information is. So I want to share with you my take about what makes this place exceptional and how that makes you exceptional, not just for your benefit, but for the benefit of all the family and friends and partners who supported you. Of course, they already know you're exceptional, but I want them to know what this place had to do with that. And I'll really be just enlarging on the remarks that Anno made. If you're looking for a concise picture of what the School of Information is about and how it got that way, you might check out the video of a talk that Anno gave a couple of weeks ago to recount her 15-year tenure as dean. Actually, my only quibble with the talk is that it wasn't sufficiently immodest. When Anno took on the deanship, this was a smallish school that was just beginning to spread its wings, and she had a huge role, not just in expanding the programs, but when endowing it with the two features that, to my mind, make it exceptional. First, broadening the faculty to include people doing ethnography, sociology, public policy, history, linguistics, and so forth. And second, by creating the culture of community, which is what alumni are always pointing to when you ask them what the most memorable feature of this place was. Now, I tend to see the world through the lens of language, and I'll be making a few points here about words. For starters, I'm never sure how to describe our program. Are we interdisciplinary, cross-disciplinary, transdisciplinary, multidisciplinary, or what? I had the idea once of describing the iSchool as diversiplinary, but that was not my greatest creation. There's this new management buzzword, cross-silo. The next time somebody asks you what the iSchool's about, you could say, oh, we do a lot of cross-silo thinking. For my part, when people ask me that question, I say, well, we're sort of eclectic, and leave it at that. Whether you call it eclecticism or interdisciplinarity or whatever, the important thing to understand is that it's intrinsic to what we do. A geologist can team up with people from other disciplines, but it's not necessary. There's nothing in the nature of a rock that requires you to think about it from different points of view. But information isn't something you can study through a single window. It lives two lives. It has a material life. It accumulates on servers and networks and software and databases, on cell phones and surveillance cameras and in MRIs. And it survives in printed documents that still have cultural weight, like books and ballots and parking tickets. Oh, and diplomas. I take it you would not want to come up here and have Anno hand you a USB drive with a PDF of your degree. But maybe next year's master's project. But information also has a social life, to quote the title of a classic book by John Seeley Brown and Paul Duguid, which I know many of you have read. Governments and corporations sweep it up. Kids text it furtively in the classroom. Democracies die without it. So any school of information is going to be anchored in two disciplinary poles. There are the formal disciplines that study the way information is stored, processed, and transmitted, CS, statistics, data science, and so on. And there are the disciplines that touch the context where information takes on meaning, the culture, the market, public life. People usually come to the iSchool with a background in one or the other of these poles, but the idea is to make everybody kind of bi-dialectal. You want students to lose their native accents, so to speak. So you can't tell by listening to somebody what their undergraduate major was. Let's sip of water here. But the relation between those poles is binary but not quite symmetrical. That transition's easier in one direction than another. Let me tell you a story I heard from Brian Smith, a computer scientist and philosopher who's now at the University of Toronto. Back in the 1960s, Brian was an undergraduate at Oberlin majoring in physics, but he was also a gifted amateur musician, and he got very interested in computer-generated music, which was then in its formative stages. Now, Oberlin also has a famous music conservatory, and after a while, the composition students sort of took over the computer music project. Now, there were two reasons for that, Brian says. On the one hand, the software just became more versatile and accessible. And then, too, as Brian says, it turns out to be a lot harder to turn a geek into a musician than to turn a musician into a geek. Brian told me that story back in the 1980s when we were colleagues at the Xerox Palo Alto Research Center, or the legendary Xerox PARC, as the press is always referring to it. John Seeley Brown was running PARC back then, and he was bringing in social scientists and artists and philosophers and people like Paul Duguid and me. The idea being that if you understood the context and aesthetics of technology use, that understanding would somehow infuse the technology itself. I think of what Henri Matisse once said, a colorist makes his presence known in a charcoal sketch. That idea did get through to a lot of technologists at PARC, but it wasn't an easy sell. One of the hardest things in the world is to recognize rigor in disciplines that are more discursive or subjective than your own, wherever you're starting from. Mathematical logicians think philosophers of logic are woolly-headed. The psychopharmacologists roll their eyes at the psychoanalysts. And it takes a huge leap of faith for a hard-nosed coder to imagine that ethnography or philosophical ethics could be anything more than just airy-fairy gobbledygook. So most tech people didn't get why PARC was doing that. And in fact, even 15 years later, when The Social Life of Information was published, a lot of people took the title to be making just a silly claim. But that title doesn't seem so preposterous anymore. The new understanding was summed up very nicely by Doug Cutting, who's another former PARC colleague who went on to create the Hadoop framework, which a lot of you know. As he put it, the biggest problems of technology today are not technical. That's what gives rise to pervasive algorithm anxiety, as I call it. 25 years ago, algorithm was a word you only ran into in the technical literature, and it just referred to a recipe for getting an optimal result, like alphabetizing a list of names or managing machine memory or whatever. Now the media are full of stories about algorithms, usually to point out how biased and fallible they are. I have a whole file of headlines like how recommendation algorithms run the world and the violence of the algorithm. And one I saw in the New York Times a couple of months ago, the algorithmification of human experience. Algorithmification, there's an expression that deserves to die horribly. Ideally in a head-on collision with cross-silo thinking. So people in tech are saying, we really have to do something about all these problems of bias and abuse and privacy and misinformation and toxic content and so on. Engineers being engineers, their first instinct is to see these as essentially technical problems and keep throwing more cycles at them. And these are very hard AI problems, and it's clear that the algorithms need a lot more tuning. Why should I trust Facebook to get hate speech right when they have other algorithms that are telling me that my interests include beauty pageants, the band Journey, and the Professional Wrestling Hall of Fame? True, this is true. But tech people tend to struggle more with the conceptual issues. How do you define the problem, and what would an optimal solution look like? They rarely give any sign of having learned the lesson that Brian learned at Oberlin in the 60s, that PARC was evangelizing for in the 80s, or that the iSchool has been teaching for several decades now. And engineers, being engineers, once again, their instinct here is to attack these questions as pure deductive exercises. Hey, we're smart, we can just reason this out. How hard could it be? Take information and propaganda. Now, this is a topic I've worked on. In fact, I just finished an article on the history of those notions for a forthcoming companion to the history of information that Princeton University Press is doing. So I was particularly interested in a slick video that Facebook put out last year about its efforts to fight fake news. At one point, the data manager for newsfeed integrity is defining these notions. So he draws a Venn diagram on the whiteboard that partitions the whole space of digital content according to two features. Everything anybody ever says is either true or false, and either deceptive or sincere. So up here on the left, this quadrant is the true but deceptive place where propaganda lives, and down here in the false and deceptive quadrant is where fake news lives, and here on the other side is the false but sincere stuff, which is just being wrong, and so on. And I'm thinking, you know, the city you're trying to police has a lot more precincts than that. He's clearly well-intentioned, but he seems to have no idea how many terabytes of philosophy and history and sociology have been dedicated to mapping the landscape of public discourse. It's basically what I think of as dorm room epistemology, the kind of thing you come up in these Red Bull-fueled dorm room bull sessions when you're in college. The problem here is that you don't see that you're putting yourself at the mercy of ordinary language. I mean the ordinary language, the everyday vocabulary that we use to talk about these things, and the everyday assumptions that pass for common sense, which are both saturated with hidden ideology and cultural preconceptions. As the philosopher Paul de Man said, there's nothing more theoretical than the language of the street. These dorm room theories are pervasive in the tech world. Jenna Burrell and Elisa Aurelia of the iSchool have written about the myths of what you could call dorm room theories of development, like the idea you can just sprinkle these rural, low-income populations with mobile phones, and an efficient market will sprout up like geraniums. Or think of the people at the iSchool here who are concerned about the fairness of hiring algorithms. And they have to contend with the sorts of dorm room theories about the tech gender gap that were exemplified in the screed that Google engineer posted a couple of years ago that had everybody up in the arms. Or if you've been watching the NBA playoffs, which I assume you've all been doing, you may have seen the 1-minute TV ad that Apple has been running to tout the privacy features of the new iPhone. It's a stream of about 25 brief images that are meant to connote privacy in one way or another. A teenager slamming the door to her bedroom, to a room with "keep out" written on it, a guy in a public bathroom walking down to the last urinal so he isn't near anybody else, somebody shredding a document, drawing the blinds, and so on. And then the text comes on the screen. If privacy matters in your life, it should matter to the phone your life is on. Now, to my mind, the privacy features I'm looking for in a cell phone are not quite the same as the ones I want to find in a public bathroom. So I sent a link to that ad to Deirdre Mulligan and asked her just how many conceptions of privacy it was evoking. She came up with half a dozen or so. Privacy is property, privacy is boundary negotiation, privacy is freedom from intrusion, and so on. I love being in a place where I have colleagues like Deirdre I can call on. Now, of course, this is just Apple's ad agency trying to whip up a souffle of feelings to sell a phone. But it gives you a sense of what a tangled set of notions the word privacy evokes in our conversations about technology and about the challenges that people like Deirdre and Chris Hoofnagel face when they try to operationalize or codify them. Now, this sort of thinking is depressingly endemic in the tech world. But my sense is that most of the students who come out of the iSchool are more or less inoculated against it. When you look at the work our students are doing at whatever level, master's, mids, mix, whatever, you usually pick up a much more nuanced sense of both the social context and the ethical implications of the project. In fact, Brian Smith was wrong about geeks and musicians. Coders and designers and data analysts don't have to become full-feathered ethnographers or ethicists or whatever. They just have to know what it would be like to be one of those things. They have to realize that these problems are difficult and not intuitive. They might call for specialized expertise, or they might require the capacity to step back and extract yourself from the everyday language and preconceptions that cloud the way you see the world. Whatever work you wind up doing, your capacity for that kind of insight is going to confer huge benefits for your organization, for society, and by the by for you. It's a competitive advantage in your career that's more important than your technical skills or just raw intelligence, which is something that young people in particular tend to put pretty much weight on. Google job interviewers used to be famous for posting these idiotic brain teasers like estimate how many tennis balls can fit in an airplane. I can't imagine wanting to work with the person who asked that question or the person who thought it had an answer. Now, if I were interviewing job candidates for Google or Facebook, I might ask them something like, how would you define privacy? Or fairness, or merit, or trust, or whatever. I'm pulling words out of recent master's projects. My guess is that the first 9 people I asked about any of those words would come up with more or less the same answer, and it would always be wrong. The 10th would say something like, oh boy, that's really complicated. Can I get back to you on that one? That's the person I'd want to talk to, and I like to think that person would be you. So, congratulations. If the past is any guide, most of you will go on to successful and fulfilling careers. And we'd like to hear about your progress because the success of our alumni redounds to the reputation of their alma mater. In that connection, let me recall that alma mater is Latin for nurturing mother. So let me close with the 4 words that every mother says to her offspring as they go out to make their way in the world. Don't forget to write. Thank you.